Hello. Well, it's the last day of February today and spring is just round the corner and it is a glorious day. Blue skies, warm sun, and we're running out of time to get these trees into their final position. So these arrived in January and I heeled them in temporarily into this bed here, and that was to make sure that the roots didn't dry out while I was getting the planting site ready. So these are all going to be fan trained around our new fence, and we've got in place some trellising made from reinforcement mesh, and we're going to be planting these into some large pots around the fence, which I'll talk a bit more about in a minute. So here I've got a plum, a gage, 2 cherries and a Mirabelle. I've got another cherry heeled in somewhere else. I've got another plum on the way, supposedly, but it hasn't arrived yet, and I'm getting a bit worried about that. So we're going to go ahead and plant all of these anyway today, and hopefully the other one will show up soon because the bare root season will be drawing to a close in the next couple of weeks. So this is one of the planting sites. Now what we've done is sink 85-litre tubs into the ground here. Now I've cut the bottom out of these tubs. I've left just an inch or so around the edge just to keep the strength. But the idea here is to try and discourage roots coming straight out into this bed, because we will be growing all sorts of vegetables in this border here. And if I just put the plants in along the fence, their roots are going to come straight out into this well-fed soil, and that's going to make it really awkward for growing the veg. Now there are other ways of doing this. You can do this with slabs, paving slabs if you like, and I can show you an example of that. So we're in the greenhouse here, and there's an apricot at the end of one of the beds, and I don't want these roots coming out into the beds either, because I'm going to be planting peppers and aubergines and such things. So along here I've sunk paving slabs into the ground here to make a little box. Now these aren't too deep. These roots can go down and away, and that's absolutely fine. But what I want to try and prevent is the roots coming out in the top, I don't know, 8 inches or so of soil and coming straight out and feeding here and getting in the way of my other plantings. So these should do the job here, and you can do something similar along a larger fence. It's a good solution, but we've decided to use those 85-litre pots. The effect is pretty much the same, the depth is about the same, and because we've cut the bottom out of the pots, there's nothing to prevent the roots going down as far as they would like. Right, so this fence faces more or less east. It would be better if this was a west-facing fence, but it is what it is, so I've got to make use of the facilities I've got here. So along this fence we're going to be planting the plums and Mirabelle. Now, if anything, this end is possibly a little bit warmer than the other end. So down here I'm going to put a gage, and that's kind of the prime position, and the gages, if anything, will value a little bit more warmth than the plums. Now the fence at the end, that is more or less north facing. It gets some afternoon sun in the summer, so I'm hoping that's going to be okay. Now I'm going to be planting sour cherries along there, and the north border was the traditional place for planting things like a Morello cherry. So I've got a Morello, I've got another sour cherry, and I've got a Duke cherry. So that's a cross between a sweet and sour. Now I really don't know how well that one's going to perform there. It might be a little bit shaded for it, but it's something we're going to find out in a few years' time. Because these are all stone fruits, I've got to wait until after bud break to prune them. Now most of the growth that they put on last year will have to be removed in order to start the fan training process. what I'm going to do today is try and position them in the best orientation with that process in mind, and after bud break I will come back and trim off the main stem and also any side branches that I don't need. Right, so I'm going to go and get those trees out and get them in here. So this is the Gage. It's early transparent Gage, and that is an old variety raised by Thomas Rivers. Of course, we've got an enormous number of varieties from Thomas Rivers. This one was a seedling of the transparent Gage, but obviously this one fruits a little bit earlier. This is reckoned to be one of the finest of the Gages. They often need quite warm conditions, so if you're thinking about planting one, pick the prime spot for the Gage. Now, I will have to cut this main stem back in the spring. Now you can see this is quite a vigorous specimen, but it hasn't got any side branches, and what we need here to start the fan training are a couple of basically Y-shaped branches starting somewhere fairly low down. So I've done a couple of videos already where I've been planting trees, and I'll leave some links to those in the description, so I'm not going to go through the whole process again. But with these fan trained trees, or these trees that I'm hoping to fan train, I have to be a little bit careful about the positioning. So we've got to go to the usual depth as indicated by the old soil mark. I don't want to get this too close to the fence because I need to allow for this main stem to expand, and it will expand quite a bit. But then I need to look at, on this one, the positioning of buds. So some of the others are feathered, and I can look at whether some of those feathers will make the bottom Y-shaped branches. But on this one there are no feathers, so I need to look at where the buds are positioned. So it would be no good me orienting this so that the buds are to the back and the front. They've got to be nicely positioned along the sides, and I can see that there are quite a few buds here that would make good starting branches. So if I position this something like that, and then when I cut this main stem back, I'll have to think about the height, but either there or maybe a little bit lower down, I should get some suitable starting branches. Right, so what I'm going to do is just turn that into the optimal position. Then I'm just going to put a tie here to hold this main stem in place. That will go in a few weeks' time after I've cut this off. What I'll do then is put a couple of canes on to the mesh trellising. I will tie wrap that to the trellising, and then I can tie in the new growth to the canes, and that will keep it nice and straight. But as with all of the stone fruits, you don't prune those in the winter. You have to wait until at least bud break, and then when they're established, you'll be pruning in the summer, and that's to avoid infection with things like silverleaf and canker. What I'm going to do here is sprinkle a little bit of mycorrhizal fungi over the roots, and I've talked about that in previous videos. It's certainly not essential, but it might be helpful to get these off to a good start. Now you can mix this up as a dip and dip the roots in a bucket of solution, and that's fine, but I think it's probably just as well to throw a handful in over the roots. When planting, it's a lot easier and less messy. So I've got the old soil mark there, and when that's down in place, I think that will be fine. So all I'm going to do now is just backfill. So when we dug out the soil for these pots, when we put the soil back, we did it in layers with horse compost. So this is a nice rich soil in here now. Now I don't like to do too much stomping around a newly planted tree. I will give it just a gentle firming. No more than that. And then I'm going to water this in well. That's not because this needs any water, but it's to wash the soil around the roots so that they're in good contact with the soil. So that's all for this one. I will come back to these when I cut these back ready for training. So this next one is Coe's Golden Drop, and so that's a really nice dessert plum. Now that's a very impressive rootstock for a bare root tree. You won't often see them quite as fine as that. Now the other one was on St. Julian A, which is pretty much the old standard plum rootstock, and that one's perfectly fine for fan training. This is on Adaptable, and I've never tried this one before, so that's going to be interesting. But it certainly looks quite impressive. I don't know if that's typical for this rootstock or not. Now we do have some feathers here, and this is a slightly annoying thing. I don't know why, but there's a branch has been removed here, and that one would have been absolutely perfect for fan training. So I don't know why they removed that, but it is a bit annoying. Now obviously we don't need any of this growth up the center, and this one at the top is definitely superfluous. So these two here, although they're not in the ideal position, ideally you'd want them to be exactly opposite each other on the stems, not in terms of height but angle. This one is a bit further around, pointing towards the fence a bit too much, but I think nonetheless we should be able to utilize both of these as the starting point for the fan. The only alternative would be to cut this stem lower and hope that we get something grow from here. But the old growth that obviously had come from here some time ago has all been removed. But I think this wood will bend somewhat, and I think that could make quite a reasonable start to a fan here. So just the same as before, I'm taking note of the old soil mark. I'll add the mycorrhizal fungi. I will backfill, tread it just very gently, and then water it in well. So I'm going to be planting this one with the main stem at a bit of an angle towards the fence, and that's because there is just so much root here. Now I could trim some of that in order to get this a little bit further back, but it's probably not necessary to do that, and I'm not inclined to trim off any of this wonderful root ball. So I'm just going to tie this one in place with the stem at a bit of an angle. There'll be plenty of room here for this to expand over the years. Now we've got a slight imbalance here in the vigour of these two stems. This one is clearly rather more vigorous than the other, but we can always play with that when we're training. So if I lower this stem more than this one will then grow away more than the lower, and we can then balance these up by moving them around. That's if I can be bothered. To be honest, that's a bit of a faff, but it might be worth doing to try and get both sides of the fan reasonably balanced. So the third spot along the fence here is for Kirke's Blue, and that's one that hasn't arrived yet. I'm hoping we'll still get it, but I'm getting a little bit nervous. It was supposed to arrive in December and I haven't heard anything about it, and the company's not responding to emails either, so we'll have to wait and see. If not, that place will be empty until next winter. So this one is a Mirabelle, and it's the classic Mirabelle de Nancy. There are two from the same sort of region of France, one from Nancy and one from Metz, and they're both traditional old sorts. Now this one presents a bit of a conundrum because it has one feather, and I suppose I could use that. It's a little bit high, so it's not ideal, but I could maybe bend that one down reasonably low, and this could serve as one of the arms, but I've got nothing of note on the other side. There are some growth buds on these short stems here, and I'm sure they would develop, but it would be really nice if something else had developed along this side here. These aren't particularly well positioned, so I may end up having to bend one of these branches slightly when I start it off. The Mirabelles can be slightly scruffy growers anyway, but I'm going to have to decide what to do later on. I will probably cut this either just above this side branch, or possibly just above this one, and then see what shoots might develop on this side, and at the same time, to prevent this one from just becoming too dominant, bend this one down quite low, at least to start with, and that will give something here a chance to shoot away, hopefully. So now we're on to the sour cherries, and the first one is the classic Morello. Now this is on colt, and that is a pretty vigorous rootstock. It's still the most common rootstock to find cherries on, and if this was a sweet cherry, I wouldn't be happy to grow this on colt for a fan here, because I've only got, well, a little less than 2 meters in height, and it would very easily outgrow that. I'm also going to have to snip off a little bit of this root, and I don't object to that in this case, because this big old root here is preventing me from getting this in the right position, so I'm going to cut that back. Maybe trim a little of these. Right, so this is actually a fantastic specimen. It was obviously growing very well last year, and if I were to be growing this as a bush, this would be the perfect tree to start with. At whatever height I wanted to head this, I would find that there's a very nice arrangement of 4 or 5 branches coming out pretty evenly spaced, so I could make a bush at various heights on this tree, and they would be pretty well formed. It's a little bit unfortunate that I'm fan training it, so almost all of this growth has to go. Now, looking at the branches that are available, there are a couple of candidates here to retain. So this whippy one at the back, it would be okay. It's a little bit weak, but there's nothing opposite it, so we have to discount that. Then we've got these two. I think these sublaterals here are not helpful, and I'll cut those back, but these two might be able to form the basis of the fan. They're a little bit higher than I would ideally like. It would be better if they were down here, but I think they should be okay. Now, the training of sour cherries is quite different from that of plums and sweet cherries, because the sour cherries fruit on 1-year-old wood, or at least primarily. So their training is a bit more like the peaches, in that you have to do a lot of replacement pruning. So that's where you take fruited wood out and tie in a new piece of replacement wood to fruit the following season. But that doesn't affect the initial decision on which branches to select. So I think I'm going to position this one somewhere around there and try and utilize these existing side branches. All of this other growth will come off again after bud break, when there's less chance of introducing disease. Now the second sour cherry is Montmorency. That's an old French variety. Now there are actually two sorts of sour cherry. There's the Morello type and the Amarelle type, and this is of the Amarelle type. It's a little less common here. Sour cherries here tend to be Morellos, but in other parts of the world the Amarelles are quite common. There's not a huge difference between them. They're distinguished mainly on the basis of the colour of the flesh and of the juice. So this variety, it's a little less common here, but it's very popular in the States. Now this is on Gisela 5. Because the sour cherries are less vigorous than the sweet, I would have preferred this, I think, on Colt, but I couldn't get this one on Colt, so I've got to take what I can get. And I think you can see from the, you can certainly see that this is a less vigorous rootstock. I've also got to trim some of this because I can't get that in the pot in the right orientation, so I need to cut some of that root off. There are a couple of candidates for starting this off. This branch is badly placed, so this one will have to go. Those two aren't too bad. This branch here, it's in a reasonable place, but it's a very weak branch. So I think I'm probably going to pick these two. I mean, it would be possible perhaps to pick the lower of those, but that branch I don't really like, so I would have to pick that one on the right hand side. So I think I might as well keep this reasonably well balanced and keep these two branches. They're a little bit higher than I'd like ideally, but this was grafted pretty high up for some reason. Don't know why. They're not normally grafted quite that high. I would expect that graft union to be a little bit further down, but I'm sure it'll be okay. And because it's on Gisela 5, it's not going to be that vigorous here at all. So the final cherry along the fence here is May Duke. Now this is also on a Colt rootstock, so ought to be quite vigorous. I have to say though that this specimen is nowhere near as vigorous as the Morello that I planted just now, and neither is the rootstock so vigorous, nor the scion. This is, to be honest, a little bit sad for a cherry tree. I'm sure it will develop perfectly fine, but all the previous trees have come from Keeper's Nursery, and I've used them numerous times in the past and always had really great trees from them. This one has come from RV Roger, and again I've used them several times in the past, but the trees I've had from them this year have all been a little bit on the weak side. That might not be a bad thing when I'm trying to fan train this here. They all look healthy, and I'm pretty sure they will all develop okay. But there is, I think, in these trees a noticeable difference between those from keepers and those I've got this year from RV Roger. But anyway, it's got quite a reasonable bit of root down here. These laterals here are of no use to me. They're far too high up. So all I'm going to do when positioning this is orient it so that there are buds on either side of the stem that when I cut this back will hopefully develop into suitable side shoots. And there are quite a few buds here. There's a couple here that are opposite each other, pointing in the right direction. They could be quite handy, and possibly something lower down might develop as well, and that would be even better. There are two buds here that would do a good job if they broke. So I'm going to position it pretty much like that, and then I've got a number of options here. I'm going to move this label though, because that is rubbing against some of the buds that I might potentially want to use later. So I'll just slide that down out of the way. So our final tree today is going to go in this large pot. Now, this is the rear wall of our garage, and this faces more or less south. And then along the other side, we've got some sheds, and they've got some wall as well. So this corner becomes a real sun trap, and I can feel it today. It's so much warmer in this corner than anywhere else in the garden, and that's because of these walls. Now, if you've got a feature like a wall, it can be really valuable, especially for tender fruit, and it's a real shame not to use it. Now, unfortunately, at the bottom of this wall we've got a concrete slab, and because we've already excavated some of this slab for the fruit cage, I know what's under it, and there's just no way to, even if I removed some of the concrete, there's just no way to plant at the base of this wall. So instead, for the first time, we're going to make use of this wall thanks to this big pot. Now, this is 125 litres. I could probably have got away with 100 litres. This is a really big pot, but at the same time, I don't want some kind of stunted dwarf tree in here. I would like it to develop reasonably well. So this pot's going to have plenty of compost for it. What we'll do on the wall is fix some timbers at either end and screw some vine eyes into those, and then we can run some wires across, and then we can fan train something on this wall. So what we've picked for here is an apricot, and I think this should be a really good position for ripening some nice apricots. So when it comes to filling this pot, it's got some drainage holes on the bottom. It's also got some in the side. Now, these aren't huge. They might be enough, but I'm going to see how that works out, and if need be, I can always enlarge these holes on the side. I don't think it will drain particularly well through the bottom. But the first thing I want to do is get a few inches of stones into the bottom so that those drainage holes run quite freely. And then we're going to put a layer of old potting soil, and because that's been used, we will mix in some horse compost with that and rejuvenate it. And then for the top layer, we'll probably mix in some multi-purpose compost and a bit more horse compost. So by the time we've finished, we should have a mixture that retains water reasonably well, but should also drain away excess. So there's the layer of stones. Now, these were all sieved out of the raspberry bed last year, and they should provide good drainage at the bottom of the pot. So this is the old potting soil, and this stuff's not too bad actually. A little bit of horse compost added to this and it will be as good as new. I might also add a little sprinkling of fish blood and bone as a slow release fertilizer, but this should be a good basis for the soil in this tub. And then we've got some newer multi-purpose compost, which is a combination of about 30% topsoil and 70% green waste, and that will make a nice basis for topping this pot off. So what I have here is an apricot. It's one of the old classics, Hemskirke, and this one is on Crimps 86. Now I haven't used that rootstock before, but I understand it's similar to St. Julian A, possibly a little bit more vigorous, and that ought to be ideal for this wall. Now this growth up here is scruffy looking and not at all helpful. There are though some nice buds developing lower down on this stem, so as with the others that we're fan training, I will be cutting this off and encouraging some of these other buds to develop. So all I've got to do now is look for an orientation where I've got opposite buds that might form the basis of our fan. And once again, I'll move this label down a bit lower so that it doesn't interfere with any of those young buds. Well, there are quite a few possibilities there. So I'm not going to put this tree central in the pot. I shall put this towards the back and roots will fill this out. And I dare say at some point we'll put some bulbs or flowers in the rest of the pot just to make it look a little bit nicer. So I'm just going to put a little bit of straw on the top of this. I don't know if that's a good idea or not, but it might help to retain the moisture, and it should certainly help to suppress any weed seeds that might be in this compost. I would do this with bark chip if I had any, but I don't have any at the moment, and I'm certainly not leaving the house to go and get some. Not in the middle of a pandemic anyway. I'll leave that clear of the stem there because I don't want damp against the stem. Now I'm sure some of this will be flying around the garden, but it should be okay after I've watered it. And of course the birds will get in there later and steal some of that, I expect. Right, so this one's finished for now. We will have to put the supports on the wall and the wires across. And of course we're going to have to keep a close eye on the watering. And at some point I'd like to connect this one up to an automatic watering system so that it never gets neglected. Because even though this is a really large pot, it will need regular watering through the summer. So that's it for the tree planting. As I said earlier, there's one missing, Kirke's Blue Plum, and if that does arrive, I will plant that in exactly the same way as the others. But that's it for this video, so thanks very much for watching, and bye for now.